to our second session of Minamata Online that deals with trade as per Article 3. I hope that we find you well wherever you are today at this time. I notice we have really a broad spectrum of participants on the east, all the way from Thailand over Africa, Botswana, all the way to the west, Mexico. So it's really terrific to have so many of you with us and from all different parts of the world. As you know, we've been holding these sessions, these Minamata On sessions, for some time now. We started in September. This is the 5th session, and it is very much our response as a Secretariat to try to reach out to you as parties and others that are working on Minamata issues and on Mercury to try to assist you as much as we can, even though we would have to do so from our offices or our homes where we are, as opposed to with you, as we would usually do if this was a more ordinary year and not a pandemic year. Our stream, our Minamata Online, is divided into 3 streams. One deals with COP preparation. A second one deals with implementation review and support, and this is an event in that stream, a stream that I lead. And we also have a stream on Mercury Science, which my colleague Toda leads. So there's some interplay between our different sessions. Sometimes we prepare the ground in one session to be able to go more deeper in another, and this is one of them. Just to introduce myself, in case we haven't met yet, my name is Claudia, and I'm the Senior Policy and Coordination Officer of the Minamata Convention. And today I'm again in the good company of a whole lot of great colleagues that will help me help you, hopefully in some ways, on the issue of trade and Article 3. As you can see displayed, hopefully at the top of your screen, but also on this first slide, I'm joined by Marianne Bailey, our Program Officer, Capacity Building and Technical Assistance. I'm joined by Eisaku Toda, the Senior Program Officer dealing with science and technical matters here at the Convention Secretariat. And a special hello and welcome to Gabi Eigenmann, who joins us not from Geneva, but from Vienna. So this is a multi-pronged effort that we are having this time. Gabi works as the Minamata policy expert for UNIDO, and she will also be presenting a little bit today. And lastly, but in no way least, my colleague Lara Ognibene, our legal officer. So with a big lineup of persons, there's also a lot of information we are going to try to convey to you, but we'll try to keep it as succinct as possible so that you also have some time at the end for questions and answers. But with that, let me just say one more thing, which is to not only to recognize that last week on the 29th, we already had a session that deals with Mercury flows that was put together by Eisaku, where we heard quite a bit in terms of what is happening in terms of Mercury, both on the supply and also on the flow perspective in terms of where we have Mercury flows, and also updates on that. We'll make reference to a little bit of that, but that gave good background already. I also want to just acknowledge that a lot of what we know and where we work from comes from this very good report that UNEP put together some years ago from 2017 on the Global Mercury Supply, Trade and Demand Report, and we'll make reference to that in here. I also would like to recognize NRDC because they have done some very good work to try to make it more understandable what we mean with forms and so on for our notifications, and we are relying on some of their materials also for this training, as you will see a little bit later. And last but in no way not least, we can only do all of this work because we can tap into the Global Mercury Partnership and also into our colleagues at the branch, the chemical branch, UNEP. So just to say thank you very much. A lot of the information that we have also comes of their reports and their work on which we try to build and help our partners. So with that, let's deep dive into provisions on trade as they are in Article 3. So Article 3 deals with a lot more than trade, but we will only be looking at the provisions at paragraph 6, 7, 8, 9, which deals specifically with trade, and Marianne will take us through that, and we will also look at the guidance that was passed. But to give you an overview over the entire session, I will give a background on why Minamata Convention addresses Mercury trade. Marianne will then go into the Article 3 requirements, and then Eisaku will take us to current information on studies and other information that we have at the level of the Secretariat on Mercury trade. And then Gabi will tell us about the UNIDO study that they have done, a very innovative approach. And last, Lara will highlight some of the output and, in fact, the workshop that we help facilitate amongst a number of countries in South America around sharing knowledge on trade. And then, of course, we hope to have a good solid amount of time also for your questions and answers. Well, questions and hopefully us answers in that regard. Great. With that, let me start, and let me also just say that, of course, our presentation will be available online afterwards, and there's also the recording of this morning, just in case you'd like to access that afterwards. And this one is also being recorded and will be accessible to you afterwards in case you'd like to return to that. So, section 1, why does the Minamata Convention regulate or look at mercury trade? Well, I'm going to go through the next 3 slides quite quickly, because just looking at the names of all of those participating, you are very well aware of why we do not want the negative effects of mercury. But going specifically to the next slide, why do we try to reduce the amount of mercury that there is? What are the risks? Why is this an issue? Well, just looking at this picture and looking at the centrality of the human there, and the fact that not only does mercury affect neurologically persons, the effects on health are also at a much deeper level to persons, and of course specifically to women, especially women of childbearing age, have a very specific vulnerability to mercury. But this comes from exposure, whether it is through eating contaminated foods or using products that may contain some forms of mercury, or perhaps just from releases of waste or other indiscriminate disposals of mercury. And then also on the other side, there are many people working in process or product processes that include mercury in some way, and so there's also occupational exposure. So the logic of the entire Minamata Convention is to be able to reduce the use and therefore the demand for mercury, and so to take it more and more out of our industry, out of our economy, and thereby to protect human health and the environment. Moving on. How is mercury used? Again, I know this audience is quite familiar with many of these, so I don't need to go into it, but you know that mercury could be in lamps and relay switches, it is used in certain processes, and if this is used in a way that is not contained, it will absolutely become possible to be a release or an emission into the environment. And these are the aspects we are trying to clamp, that the convention tries to minimize as much as possible. He has also attached a very specific illustration of artisanal and small-scale gold mining, because this is, of course, a very large area of mercury use, a very complex area of mercury use. And as captured in the bubble, there are many substitutes for mercury in products and mercury processes that are better, probably more cost-effective, and certainly safer. And so the logic of the convention is to try to move more and more to these alternatives. Next and last, in terms of the illustrations, mercury finds its way into the environment and human health, all of the uses, or can at least find its way through all of these uses. And as we know through the different assessments that we've had so far, artisanal and small-scale gold mining on the one hand, and coal burning are 2 of the largest anthropogenic sources of emissions. So, where does that leave us with trade? The next slide is a picture that a number of you have seen before, of course, because it comes from the 2017 report. What we've done here is just to put a dotted line really around what we could call something like the mercury trade nexus, because the trade in mercury is really to be able to be using it or to use it in ASGM or in certain products or in certain processes. And this is the area where the convention is trying to has put in place certain obligations and procedures so that this becomes less and less, and in fact becomes better at taking it over the long term out of our active flows. And on the right, you'll see a little bubble that in a way is a moment captured in history or in time, because it captures the perspective that global mercury demand is expected to decline in response to this treaty. In the next slide, I'll show you what happened. This slide is very much a moment in time in 2008. It reflects the Mercury trade at that time in terms of quantity and direction, in terms of export and importers. And this is the year that was before it was decided to come together to make it legally, to negotiate the legally binding instrument. So this is sort of really where we were in 2008. Moving on, 2015, which is 2 years after the Minamata Convention was completed in terms of negotiations and signed in October 2013, we see an immediate impact in terms of flows because the United States and also the EU had by this time instituted export bans, and the entire trade, if you may, the flows completely realigned themselves. Moving on, we see, and we saw this, we learned this through Eisaku's session last week, we see now in 2017 that again the flows are changing or are narrowing in many ways. Perhaps here and there they are changing, but in most ways they're actually narrowing and going lower. And lastly, the next slide shows you the overall picture. It goes all the way up to 2018, in other words, just 2 years ago. And whether you look at the dramatic decrease of Mercury traded worldwide in the last 10 years, or you look more long-term in terms of the last 20 years, there's definitely been complete, a very, very big disruption in this. So moving on. On the left is an indication of the amount or the demand of Mercury by sector and by the users. This is a slightly dated or hopefully dated illustration because it was part of the 2017 report, but it gives you an idea where in which sectors the Mercury by quantity was being used. Lastly, before I complete this section, I just wanted to pull up this picture again of the supply and demand and change the angle not only to where trade is, but also the fact that it is related, the entire flow is related also to what happens later with Mercury, whether it goes into interim storage or into long-term disposal facilities. And by this, I just want to say that while our presentation today is firmly only about Article 3, there are, of course, many linkages to other articles in this way in our convention, and that really signifies the life cycle approach of reducing demand and overall managing managing Mercury. And before I hand to Marianne to actually take us through each of these provisions that we have in Article 3, the next slide addresses the question that has come up in question time at times. And so I just want to leave you with this information. It's a lot of text on the screen, and you are welcome to look at this in more detail later. But in essence, we have been asked about the linkage, relation, etc., between the Minamata Convention and the Rotterdam Convention. And so I would just like to highlight here that Article 3 of the Minamata Convention regulates the import and export of mercury as a main instrument to reduce the supply and trade of mercury, while the Rotterdam Convention, which in its full name is called the Rotterdam Convention on the Prior Informed Consent Procedure for Certain Hazardous Chemicals and Pesticides in International Trade, also includes trade-related obligations with regard to mercury compounds. And these are per Annex 3 of the Convention. To highlight that the Rotterdam Convention is about information exchange on the environmental use, sound use of a particular substance, in this case, mercury compounds that are listed in that annex. Also, just to point out, in Article 17, paragraph 4 of the Minamata Convention, and this is captured in the grey box, a national focal point is to be identified by parties and designated to be the point of contact for the exchange of information under our convention with regard to the tasks as foreseen under Article 3. The Rotterdam Convention has a similar model, but for a different purpose. According to their Article 4, paragraph 1, parties to the Rotterdam Convention shall designate one or more national authority to be authorized to act on its behalf in the performance of the functions as foreseen by that convention. So in some ways, some similarities, but different purposes. Let me leave it at that and hand it over to Marianne Bailey to take us into the real crunch of today's presentation, which is really about the article and the publication. Over to you, Marianne.
Thank you, Claudia, and hi, everyone. As Claudia so well introduced, Article 3 contains control measures aimed at limiting the global supply of mercury to complement and reinforce really the demand reduction and control measures that are throughout the convention and specifically in Articles 4 to 7. It's important to note from the outset that the trade provisions do not apply to trade in mercury added products and mercury waste. These are addressed elsewhere in the convention. And it's important also to note that Article 3 does not apply to mercury used for laboratory scale research or reference standards, or naturally occurring trace quantities of mercury that may be found in metals or ores or coal or chemical products and the like. So as Claudia said, we don't have time or a possibility today to go over all the elements of Article 3 related to mercury supply and mercury stocks and trade, but I want to give you some important context for how these work together with the trade provisions in the next couple of slides. So this just gives you an overview of main sources of mercury supply. Those are primary mining of mercury, that is, byproduct mercury that would come from the production of non-ferrous metals in some cases, or other byproduct mercury production, such as from natural gas cleaning. Another big source is the decommissioning of chlor-alkali facilities. And then there's also, of course, mercury recovered from wastes and used products that contain mercury. And there are often government or private mercury stocks in a country. So we'll talk a little bit more about a couple of these in the next slide. So some important points about how mercury supply sources and mercury trade kind of work together, especially in our convention. So mercury from primary mercury mines is restricted by Article 3. The mines need to be phased out. No new mines are to be developed. And the mercury from primary mines can only be used for specifically allowed products and processes, not including artisanal and small-scale gold mining. That's a very important point, especially for countries that are developing their ASGM national action plans. And they can refer to NAP guidance that was adopted by the COP, and that will have very useful information on trade aspects of their plans, including how to prevent mercury that is imported into their country for other uses from being diverted to ASGM. For chlor-alkali, the convention also controls the export and use of mercury from decommissioned chlor-alkali plants. So this source was identified in Article 3 because of the large amounts of mercury that would potentially become available from the sector between now and 2025, which is the phase-out date for mercury use in the chlor-alkali sector under Article 5. So with a view to keeping these, the potentially large stocks, many of these plants contain hundreds of tons of mercury on site. So with a view to keeping the excess mercury from those sites off the market, Article 3 restricts the use of it from the use of excess mercury from decommissioned chlor-alkali plants, and specifically, parties need to take measures to ensure that the excess mercury from this source is to be disposed of according to Article 11 requirements without recovery or reuse. And then finally, on stocks, there is a requirement for parties to endeavor to identify their stocks and sources of mercury supply. And the the Conference of the Parties at COP1 adopted guidance to assist parties in reasonably obtaining this information. So individual stocks can include existing inventory or stockpiles, and then mercury generating supplies are also come from a variety of sources in a country. Moving on. Now, here's the meat of the trade provisions of Article 3. So it's a prior informed consent procedure, and Article 3 provides procedures for controlling the trade of mercury through a prior informed consent requirement. The relationship and obligations between the parties to trade mercury are specified, and rules governing party to non-party trade are also elaborated in the article. Parties are required to not allow the export of mercury unless the importing country provides written consent. The mercury is for an allowed use or environmentally sound storage, and all the other conditions of Article 3.6 are met. And parties are to not allow the import of mercury without consent by the relevant government official, ensuring that both the mercury source and the proposed use are allowed under the convention and allowed through applicable domestic law. So there are some variations in these rules, which I will cover in a moment, but I do want to reiterate the point that Claudia made earlier. Oh, no, that's a different point, sorry. I want to make a key point here that the rules become effective for a party as soon as the convention enters into force for that party. So we currently have 124 parties, so these rules are effective for most countries in the world, and they impact non-parties as well, as I'll describe in just a moment. So we're going to work through 3 scenarios of how this is meant to work. And there are probably lots of variations on these scenarios, but we're giving you the main ones. So in scenario 1, the exporter is a party and the importer is a party. So moving on to the next slide. In this scenario, the mercury export is allowed if the importing party has provided the exporting party with its written consent, and the mercury is only for a use allowed to the importing party under the convention or for environmentally sound interim storage per Article 10. And in scenario 2, this is where an exporter is a party and the importer is a non-party. In this scenario, the mercury export is allowed when the non-party importer has provided the exporting party with its written consent and certified that it has measures in place to ensure the protection of human health and the environment, and to ensure its compliance with the provisions of the storage article, which is Article 10, and the waste article on final disposal, Article 11. And that such mercury will be used only for use allowed under the convention or for environmentally sound interim storage per Article 10. In the last scenario, and we'll go into more detail on all of this and how it works with forms and guidance in just a moment, but in the last scenario, the exporter is a non-party and the importer is a party. So in this scenario, the mercury export is allowed when the exporter non-party has provided a certification that the mercury is not from primary mercury mining or excess mercury from decommissioning chlor-alkali facilities, and the importing party has provided its written consent. So you'll recall that Article 3 restricts the export and use of mercury from primary mercury mining so that it's not available for use in ASGM, and it restricts the use of excess mercury from decommissioning chlor-alkali plants. And moving on, now here's the variation. The convention in Article 3.7 allows for parties and non-parties to issue consent through a general notification of consent that they provide to the Secretariat. This is an alternative to consenting on an import-by-import basis. A general notification of consent must include any terms and conditions the country requires with respect to the mercury trade, For example, a country might put a term and condition that the import has to be in compliance with the country's national chemicals legislation. The party or the non-party may revoke the general consent at any time and instead use the consent procedures outlined previously. Now, because using a general notification of consent would mean that there is limited or no information about shipments of mercury being provided to the importer, countries should really consider carefully whether they have suitable controls in place for handling mercury to use this option effectively. To date, we have received notifications of this type from 4 parties. Those are Canada, Japan, Thailand, and the United States. And in a moment, I will show you how to find those on our website. So I won't reiterate all the words on this slide, but it's just a summary of the key trade provisions in Article 3. And moving on. Now, how do parties manage all this? It's because it is rather complicated. So fortunately, at COP1, the parties adopted forms and guidance, and those are available in all 6 UN languages on our website, and I'll show you how to find them in a moment. So those are the forms, and there's also guidance. So very importantly, and this is the point that Claudia mentioned earlier, parties need to designate a focal point for exchanging these forms. That's outlined in Article 17.4 of the Convention, and the focal points are listed on our website at the Country tab. So if a focal point in a country changes, it's very important that that country let the Secretariat know right away of the new focal point. If not, there could be some real tangible problems for the importers or the exporters. In the next slide, we're going to take a look more closely at the forms. So this is, I know there's a lot of fine print here, and you'll be able to refer to this later, but basically Form A is for the provision of written consent by a party to the import of mercury. Form B is for the provision of written consent by a non-party to the import of mercury. Form C is the form for non-party certification of the source of mercury to be exported to a party. And Form D is the form for general notification of consent to import mercury. So these forms were designed to ensure that all the scenarios mentioned earlier, that there would be sufficient information for each scenario that is exchanged between the importer and the exporter. So the information is to be completed by both the importing country and the exporting country, and the importing country is to indicate whether consent is granted or denied. So these are to be transmitted directly between parties using the contact information for the concerned party's focal point. And it's recommended that the parties provide the Secretariat with copies of these forms. But the form for providing general notification of consent to the import of mercury, Form D, is to be provided to the Secretariat. Now, to wrap up, I just want to show you in the next slide where you can find these things. So if you go to the Convention tab on our website, there will be, in the drop-down menu, forms and guidance. And these are right on the top of the list because they're in Article 3. So you have both the forms and the guidance in those first 2 items there on the left. And as I said, they're in the 6 languages. And then in the next slide, we can see where to find the notifications. And these would be the general consent notifications. And those are found under countries and then in the drop-down menu notifications. So I know it's a lot to cover, but this session and the slides will be available on our website soon, and you can refer back to them, and you can always send questions to the Secretariat. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to my colleague Eisaku Toda, and he will give us a brief update on current information and studies on Mercury trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. And I'm going to the next slide. As Claudia mentioned earlier, I lead the other stream of Minamata Online, which is Mercury Science. Last week, we had a session entitled the Mercury material flow, supply, demand, trade. So after Marianne's explanation about the trade control measures and the convention, I would like to touch upon where we stand with the trade, Mercury trade. At that session last week, we invited Mr. Peter Maxson, who was the lead author of the UNEP 2017 Global Mercury Supply and Trade and Demand Report, which Claudia mentioned in her explanation on the current mercury flow, and also we invited Barbara Henders, Miss Barbara Henders, who presented the IUCN study, and we are going to hear from UNIDO, from Gabi about the UNIDO study, which you see that you see on the right hand side, and also at this at the session last week, we heard presentations on the material flows in US and South Africa, and we will continue to do so next week on the 15th of October on mercury flows in China, Japan, Russia, and South America. So if you're interested, please sign in. Next slide, please. This is this slide is made from the report by IUCN on the illicit, informal trade in East Africa, West Africa, Guyana, Suriname, and Mindanao in the Philippines. I'm not going into too much details, but you can see this in the slide that we posted on the website. So it is clear that the official trade data does not capture this informal or illicit flow of mercury. Next slide, please. So these are kind of anecdotal pieces of information. There have been efforts to quantify the illicit trade. One such example is a UNEP report that I listed earlier, UNEP 2020 illegal trade in chemicals, and the map on the left-hand side compares the mercury demand in ASGM, estimated demand, and the discrepancies between the demand and the import-export. So it is clear that there should be some unknown flow of mercury, and which means that it's very important for the implementation of Article 3 of the Convention to involve the customs authorities, trade control authorities, and the police to effectively implement the provisions of the Minamata Convention. Next slide, please. So if we also looked into the Minamata initial assessments that were implemented in many developing countries and countries in economies in transition to ratify and implement the Minamata Convention. And this table is too small, but we expected that there may be some information about mercury trade, but the mercury inventories in MIA's Minamata assessments largely focus on emissions and releases, and we much information about trade. But we noted that, for example, in this Nigerian example, the third row explains how Nigeria plans to implement the trade provisions of Article 3, in which they say that they are going to amend the Rotterdam Convention Act to include mercury trade in it. And then my last slide, next slide, please. This is, we also looked at the national action plans on the artisanal small-scale gold mining and pursuant to Article 7. And these NAPs are supposed to describe the country's strategies for managing trade and preventing the diversion of mercury to ASGM. And the NAP guidance document includes advice on establishing such strategies. We looked into the Mongolian national action plans, and they analyze and try to find out the illicit mercury flows. And now we are looking at these efforts with a great expectation. So with this, I would like to turn to Gabi to present their findings in the unit of study. Gabi, you have the floor. Thank you. On board.
Yes, thank you. And good afternoon to everyone. Yes, I would just like to give you a snapshot or just provide you some information on the study we did in 2018, Curbing Illicit Mercury and Gold Flows in West Africa, Options for a Regional Approach. Next slide. Just to give you a little bit, I mean, this is the objective, to say what are the benefits of a regional approach, what could be the possible elements. And maybe here at the end, I would very encourage everyone also to think if you have something to share with us, when you have already taken a regional approach in trade, in controlling trade of mercury or maybe any other hazardous substance. Next slide. Well, the report is also available in French, and you will get the link at the end. How it came to it, we were requested by 12 ECOWAS countries that have ASGM as a major sector using mercury, and they were asking us to say, could we have a closer look if a regional approach would make sense, and also have a look what are really the flows of mercury, but also the flows of gold in the region, since there are statistics available, but as we have heard also or seen in the UNEP study, statistics sometimes don't give the full picture. So then we got support from Switzerland to conduct it, and we worked with the global initiative to do it, and with a lot of national, very experienced experts. Next slide. Or you can just go to the next one. I think this is just shows the flow. So why a regional approach? No, I said the countries really ask us, we have a problem with the mercury that comes in. It comes in through different ports, and it's distributed in the country. We have not really good overview. So if someone controls it in the country, the mercury will find its way through another entry point. So they said we would need a regional approach to really address this, to better control the import of mercury. It makes sense, especially in this region, but then many other regions, because with the control of mercury, you can also assist the phase out of mercury in the ASGM sector. And we have heard from previous presentation, the Minamata Convention takes a life cycle approach. That's the beauty of this convention. So we have all these entry points, but then we have also to look at them. But that was the idea. So not only look at the demand, also at the supply, and even at the end of the pipe when it comes to waste. Such a regional cooperation or regional approach for mercury or even gold, as we suggested, can also build the basis for other coordination in the implementation of the convention. and even go broader. If you have seen, UNEP has done a study on chemicals, on trace of chemicals. So when we start looking at controlling a trade of mercury, we could also look at other hazardous substances that enter the country through illegal ways. And just to say that some countries said, you know, for us, or some border controllers said, it's like drugs. Mercury is like drugs, no? So it's very difficult to trace, and it comes in through very creative ways. So even if we look at, we can even have broader synergies with other very relevant topics. And last but not least, resources are not endless, and if we take a regional approach, if we do maybe some training or harmonize regulations in a joint manner, we can use the resources more efficient and effective. So what are the elements of such a regional approach, or what could be? I mean, in the case of West Africa, we found there is no specific regulation for mercury trade. There are some regulations on using in the country, then some maybe ban the import, but then it's still allowed to use it. So it's not harmonized within the countries. Many ministries are involved in this. So it's not only the Ministry of the Environment, you have the Ministry of Mine, Health, Trade, Finance, and Commerce. And as in many countries, the ministries do not really talk to each other so often. So the collaboration between the ministries would need to be enhanced. It has already been done through some Minamata committees, or some that were established on the Minamata projects like the MIA or even the NAP. But this harmonization needs to be done at national level, but then also scale it up at regional level. So that's needed. Then improve the knowledge of mercury flow. Much is moving around in an illegal manner. I mean, if you look at the official data, 50 tons are imported per year into the entire region. The demand from ASGM is up to 400 tons. So we don't have really the data available. I think once the reporting about the Minamata implementation starts, that could also improve, but we need to have better data to also tackle the issue and harmonize the regulations. Even in the country, the movement in the country is quite complex. Next slide. Then increased engagement with the customs and other border controlling entities. We had also some discussion with them. They were not aware about this issue about mercury, and they're key. They're really key, and especially at the seaports. When we see in here the entry point is there, it comes mainly in through Togo and Ghana, and then it goes to another hub, which is Burkina Faso, and then it's spread in the entire region. So seaports, if you look at the seaports, controlling there, it would really help and make a difference. And then, as I said, build up sustainable capacity of these entities. And there I had to revise my approach. They said, you know, regional approach is fine, but if you want to build up capacity, you have to do it country-wise. So here, to make sure that if you train 10 people, that maybe 2 remain there, because you have this fluctuation. Okay, then some other elements of the regional approach is, of course, continuing working with the ASGM sector and make mercury-free mining more attractive, so that the demand also decreases for this hazardous substance. Then there are some regional legislation also in West Africa, for example, the Mineral Mining Act. It needs to be concretized. It's an act, but it has to be triggered down in really laws and regulations, and also has to be controlled. And then from another perspective, the countries that import gold could also improve their control. To say it's not entirely related to the Minamata Convention, but if the demand for mercury-free gold increases, that would also help to phase out this hazardous substance. And just one thing to add, I think it's also the mining parties have also we could support them as well, the primary mercury mining parties, to make sure that this mercury is not exported to these ASGM countries, which is in ECOWAS, we suspect that mainly comes from primary mining, the mercury. So if we want to learn more about this study, there are the 2 links. It's available in English, mais il existe aussi en français. So just visit our website or go directly to the link or send me an email. I can also send it directly. Thank you.
So if I may ask my colleague Lara to take us through the last segment. Over to you, Lara.
Thank you, Claudia, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I would like, in the last 2 slides of this presentation today, focus on one initiative the Minamata Secretariat is carrying out. So if you move to the next slide, please. So as part of a broader project funded by the European Commission and building and aimed at building the capacity of developing countries to effectively implement Article 3 of the Convention, the Secretariat co-organized with the government of Bolivia a workshop to exchange information on mercury trade among a key set of countries in the region, and with the objective of supporting them in implementing their obligations under Article 3 of the Convention. This workshop was held in October in 2019 in La Paz, and it gathered participants, including national focal points of the Minamata Convention, but also customs officers and other relevant representatives from other relevant ministries and competent authorities and stakeholders. So it was really, the concept behind this workshop was to provide an opportunity for different stakeholders to meet and to sit at the same table and discuss common issues. As we recognize that one of the issues sometimes in implementing, or main issues in implementing Article 3, was a lack of coordination both at national and regional levels, where sometimes the national focal points sitting in the ministry didn't have enough communication with the, for example, customs officers on the ground or with relevant counterparts in other ministries. So that was an opportunity to bring all these stakeholders together and to collaboratively discuss as a task force and exchange information and perspectives from a country perspective, but also at the regional level on the successes, but also the challenges that these countries are encountering in implementing the convention in their respective countries, and also from a broader regional perspective. And also it was an opportunity to explore possible solutions at the national level, and again, also at a broader sub-regional level, to really try and improve the traceability of mercury as it crosses the borders of these countries in the sub-region. If we move to the next slide, please, you will see that as a follow-up to the Bolivia workshop, the Secretariat agreed with Peru, who also attended the workshop, to fund the development of a protocol for customs officers on how to handle confiscated mercury in the country. Again, this was funded under the umbrella of the same project funded by the EU, the European Commission. And the idea is now to develop a protocol as one expected output of a larger project implemented by the Ministry of Environment of Peru and funded by multiple donors, with the purpose of developing a more integrated management system for seized mercury. So starting from detection and seizure, but also post-seizure processes to promote traceability of mercury in Peru. And as you see from the slide, the expected outcome of the project includes also the reduction of illegal trade, reduced exposure to mercury by customs officers and miners through a quite comprehensive approach, which will address the legislative framework, trying to harmonize the existing legislative framework relevant to confiscated mercury in Peru, but also improve the facilities and equipment for the storage on confiscated mercury, and also finally providing some capacity building for customs officers, not only to detect, but also to handle confiscated mercury. So finally, this protocol that will be developed in Peru, for Peru, is also meant to provide a useful guidance to other countries in the sub-region in particular, or in the Andean region, which face similar challenges. So with this, I will conclude my presentation, our presentation today, and I turn over to Claudia for our Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lara, Gabi, Eisaku, Marianne. I'm sure we've given far too much information perhaps for one session, but we would be grateful for any questions you might have. But I'm going to ask my colleague Marianne, who's been watching very carefully the chat box, to scan what is coming in, and we shall try to give as good a reply as we can amongst all of us that are here. So Marianne, may I hand over to you, and you pass the questions to us as you see fit, please.
Yes, and just for our participants, if you're having any trouble entering your question into the Q&A section over there on the right side of your screen, you can also send it to the chat section. So we do have one question in from our colleague Eigenmann on the prior informed consent procedures between focal points of the convention. If we could clarify about those procedures between focal points of the convention regarding mercury trade and controlling illegal imports. Claudia, can you take that one?
Well, I'll start with a small chapeau, but then I'll hand over to Lara to fill in on details, or any of my other colleagues. But essentially, the question is a very important one. But to clarify, the convention provisions is about legal trade. It is about trade and how to manage that. So under the convention, that is the provisions that we have. It is, however, very obvious that as the official trade is being reduced, and as we see in these streams, that the demand for mercury has not exactly diminished everywhere, even though that is also part of the work of the convention overall. And so there is, of course, mercury being diverted. Let me just say that the role of a official role of a focal point is to be part of the communication stream of the official trade. But I would imagine that it would be very important for all authorities to be as informed as possible of any information that is forthcoming of other flows of trade, also illegal flows of trade, of course. But Lara, if I may maybe ask you just to add what you may need to add, and of course my other colleagues may also still have something to say on this very crucial point of how we overall reduce the flow of mercury. Lara?
Yes, thank you very much. And I don't have much to add to the response you already, Claudia already provided, except that as you may know, the text of the convention does not define illegal trade as such, and it's not mentioned in the text of the convention. Illegal trade can be defined as such in the regulatory framework of countries, and therefore in that context national focal points may follow the internal procedures to report illegal trade as defined by their own country. So back to their legal authorities in the country as provided in each country. as Claudia mentioned, the convention doesn't deal directly with illegal trade, and the functions that are attributed to the national focal point under the convention relate to the control of the legal trade of mercury. Thank you. I don't know if any other colleague would like to add to this point. Thank you very much.
I just see one small follow-up question, which is, of course, the important one about, is there, I see it from Claudia Vega, is there a strategy to look at this issue or to prevent that this happens in parallel? Well, the important part in all of this is that this is for the convention parties to decide in terms of how to look at this, but it's also extremely important in the national context of countries that at a national level are looking at what is happening in their national context. And in some ways, the work also that was done, the information sharing, the getting to know each other, the community building, so to speak, that we saw happening in Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Panama. I think I've now got all the countries that met last year in that particular setup, is to make each other aware of this and to help. There's also work, and I don't know, Eisaku, if you maybe want to speak a little bit to the customs official type of element, but there are different pathways to try to come at this particular challenge that we see. Part of it is at the national level, part of it is customs level, part of it is how the country deals with, if it does get diverted to ASGM, the ASGM context. But it is a multi-pronged effort that would have to be looked at. Thank you.
Well, if this is Eisaku, if I may, with regard to the ASGM, I pointed out in my presentation that the National Action Plan on ASGM is expected to address the strategies for managing trade, and this includes, of course, the managing the illicit flow of mercury. In terms of customs officers, we participate in the Green Customs initiatives led by UNEP to build the capacity of the customs officers to control the trade in hazardous substances and also the environmental goods or the wildlife and so on. And also we cooperate with the World Customs organizations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, both of you, for those great answers. We do have a question in from Tiraporn, and she is asking if there's any chance that the mercury compounds import and export have to comply with both PIC procedures under Rotterdam Convention and Minamata Convention. And I will just start us off by saying that the Minamata PIC procedures apply only to elemental mercury. So at this stage, there isn't that kind of specific overlap, but I wonder if Claudia or perhaps Eisaku wants to elaborate on that a bit. Eisaku?
Thank you, Marianne. As I mentioned, we understand convention lists the mercury compound as pesticides, and the rationale is that the Rotterdam Convention is to control the international trade of the substances that are regulated in some parties, and the rationale is that mercury compounds in pesticide are regulated in many countries. Moreover, it should be noted that the Annex A of the Minamata Convention says that the pesticide, biocides, and tropical antiseptics containing mercury is to be phased out by 2020. So we do not expect so many trade in mercury compounds in pesticide, but as Maria noted, the elemental mercury trade is controlled under Minamata Convention, and the mercury compounds as in pesticide is controlled under the Rotterdam Convention. Thank you.
And just to add one single sentence maybe, which is just that if you want to look at which mercury compounds, because it's not all mercury compounds, then just have a look at Annex 3 of the Rotterdam Convention, because it's clearly outlined which mercury compounds are affected by the procedure. Thank you.
Can I just add something? I think what is very important that people understand is prior consent approach. And that is similar for PIC and Minamata. So I think that's very important that the ones who have to look at these forms and that they understand what is needed and how does it work. And you can only allow when there is a consent. So that I think is very key, and also very important that it's the focal point is officially nominated, and there is one we had in the previous session on Latin programs where that's very important. Maybe you think focal point, but this is really, really important that you have that focal point and they know how to deal with these articles and what does it mean, the prior consent.
Okay, great. That's a super important point. Thank you. I guess this might be a little out of order in terms of grouping the questions, but I'm just going to go in order so I don't miss any. So I'd like to go to Janaba's question. In Peru, how does the protocol account for the storage of confiscated products? And Lara, I'd like to turn to you for that one.
Yes, thank you, Marianne. As I mentioned when I presented the project that is being has been developed by the Ministry of Environment of Peru, which aims at strengthening institutional capacities for the management of mercury seas within the framework of the Minamata Convention. One of the outputs of this project, of the products of this project, will be will address the facilities for the storage of seized mercury. So while our protocol, which we will develop, will be developed with our support by the ministry on how to handle the confiscated mercury, which will be a guide for customs officers on how to safely handle confiscated mercury from the moment it is being detected up to when it is stored, interim storage or in a final storage facility. Another component of the big umbrella project will address the issue of strengthening and building new and better storage facilities for allowing the safe storage of confiscated mercury. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. I realize we're running out of time, and that your answer to that question really gets also at the question from Shailand about seized mercury. And just to finish up on that one, the questioner asks, has the Secretariat issued any guidelines to WCO, World Customs Organization, for that? And the answer to that would be no. And if we have any more detail, we'll follow up in writing with you. And we do have, it looks like some very timely news from Zygum. He's pleased to inform that the Federal Cabinet has approved the ratification of the Minamata Convention on mercury under the chairmanship of the Prime Minister of Pakistan in a meeting held just yesterday. So we really appreciate that welcome news. That's wonderful. Thank you. And let's see, sorry, this is kind of hard to navigate all this. But one more from Tiraporn, or a comment. It's about the PIC question, in particular, if DNA under Rotterdam and focal point under Minamata is different. And that would depend on the country. In most cases, they probably would be different. Some countries may choose to have them be the same focal point, but that would just almost be by chance, and they would be listed on the websites of the particular convention. And let me see if I'm yeah, there was a bit more on legal and illegal, and I think we've covered that largely. And since we're out of time, I would like to suggest that we will carefully peruse any questions that we might have answered too quickly or brushed over by mistake, and we will get back to you. And I think we will also have those posted when we post the presentation. So with that, unless there's anything burning, I'm going to turn back to Claudia to close us up.
Thank you, Marianne. We're always in good hands with you for this function. So thank you for doing that and for taking care for at least the first replies on some of those. As Marianne says, we will actually just go very carefully through the ones that you have noted here, and where we might not have had enough time to answer, will indeed supply a short written Q&A on. If there's something else that's burning that or that comes to mind after the session, please feel absolutely free to let us know. We are happy to try to help, and more than that, we are happy to learn from your experiences to know more where we can be more helpful in terms of additional information. So with that, we have been always trying to keep a good tradition of finishing on time because everybody is quite busy. So I'd like to close it and just say huge thanks to all my colleagues that are on the screen here, but also to the team behind the scenes, Pablo, Lynn, Pak, everybody that makes this happen and happen so smoothly every time. We wish you all the very best to all of you and hope you stay safe and well. And we look forward to having you with our next session of Minamata Online. Have a great, bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks for joining us.